If you are just starting out in metalwork, a tool you might want to add is a chop saw. This has what they call an abrasive wheel, and it's just like what it says. It's an abrasive, so it pretty much grinds away at the metal. Doesn't necessarily cut it. Great thing, a pro for that, is it does give you good angles. The downside to this type of saw is it leaves a bit of cleanup. So right here with a grinder wheel, you're able to clean up all those edges. As you can see, the extra flashing and stuff can easily be cleaned up. Looks really great just by a couple passes. A must-have tool that you will need is an angle grinder. As you can see here, I will be cutting this steel with a cutoff wheel on that grinder. It makes it really easy. The cuts aren't quite as perfect as with the chop saw, but it does a great job. The plus side is you're able to clean it up right then and there without having to switch tools. Here I'm just laying out the frame. The important thing would be is to get your angles just right. I'm using some clamps here that I had left over from a wood project. Works great. Puts those angles right at 90, which is what you want. You could also check with a tape measure the diagonals just to double check if you want. And you'll probably notice that I am not doing the full weld. This is what's called tack welding. Really, what I'm doing is just making a bunch of small little welds kind of on all the different corners. That makes it so that it doesn't shift or move when the steel is being cooled down. It kind of keeps everything nice and straight. And I also only tack weld everything until I know it's all right. So I actually won't go through and do my full welds until I've kind of test fitted everything, which makes it easier if you make a mistake and you need to grind or cut something off. You're not having to cut through an entire weld. Same deal here. I'm going to be using a bunch of magnets and clamps to hold everything in place, just to make sure it's got the right angle before you go through and do a full weld on every member. And kind of as a side note, if you're just starting out with welding, you'll definitely be picking up a bunch of these little clamps and magnets along the way. Those red square magnets, they're really cheap and easy. It's just best to pick up a set of those from the beginning. Kind of take a note as well that I'm flipping it over every once in a while and doing both sides with the tack welds. That just keeps everything square and straight. Here is a part where I would actually deviate from the plans. To give yourself a little more leg room and pedal room, I would actually shift this member off a couple inches to one side. And for 2 in a row, here's another part where I would deviate. Depending on what stock steel you have at your supplier, this floor pan came in a 2-foot by 3-foot size, and well, my frame was only 22 inches outside to outside, so I had to chop off a couple inches. Not that big of a deal, but if you want to save some cutting, just make it 2 feet and then it'll save you. You'll notice I'm going through and stitch welding this floor pan. What that is, it's pretty much a process where I'm only going through and making welds that are about 3, maybe 4 inches long, and that is plenty sufficient to hold that pan, and you won't burn through the thin sheet metal of the floor pan as well. Now moving on to the seat. I know a lot of people have questions on how to make go-kart seats or mini bike seats, and they're pretty simple. I use just some cheap OSB or plywood, whatever you got lying around will work. You cut it out, you pick up some foam and some staples, cut that out to the shape and go at it. The hardest part, I'd say, is having to go to the fabric store with your wife and hunting down what material you want. The best material to use is marine grade vinyl. Almost all fabric stores will have it. It's a little more expensive than your just typical fabric, but you don't need that much. Roughly 1 yard will do about a go-kart this size. And so I would have to say I think the marine grade vinyl is well worth the extra price, just because you know it will last a lot longer than any of the cheap stuff. You'll notice here that I did not build this seat frame from scratch. It did come off an old Yerf Dog go-kart that I had, but it ended up working, I think, perfect for this size kart that I was doing. And take note, make sure you add gas when you're welding. If not, the weld will turn out like that did. That is if you are using a MIG welder. If you're using a flux core welder, well, you don't need gas. So you can keep that in mind if you are on the fence about which welder to get. Or you can check out my other videos, which I do quite a few welding videos. Maybe one of those will help you out choose whether you should stick with a flux core or step it up to MIG. My only other note on the MIG welding is it does save a lot on cleanup. So, enough about that. Let's get back to the seat. Remember, it's a lot easier to do a pilot hole than the larger hole. And second, if you measure twice and drill once, then you'll know it will fit right into place. Another side note, I did like this seat because it was an adjustable length, so that's why I used this one, and worked out great. Next up, the steering. What I'd used for the steering shaft is some 5/8 round bar stock. That seemed like a good size, and well, frankly, that's what I had lying around in my garage. That with some washers and some bushings is pretty much all the steering entailed. Let's talk for a second about those drill bits. I'd have to say they do work great if you're drilling into wood. Metal, not so much. And the only reason why I didn't use that cordless drill anymore is, well, the battery died. And since I'm in my garage, I have no shortage of electricity, so that's why I pulled out the electric drill. And I actually do like that drill. I've used it quite a bit. It works great. And just to show that it can be done, I switched over for the bigger holes onto the drill press. And yes, that is still the Harbor Freight drill bit. So it can do metal. It just takes a little love and care, and it will get through it. And as a side note, that cutting lube does work well for the larger holes or larger cuts. Now for the layout of the steering, this is where you can kind of play around a little bit. I'm a 6'4", pretty tall guy, so I off the bat knew I wanted a larger cart or longer cart. So that is one of the reasons why I did the seat first, so then I can actually sit down and physically hold the steering wheel in hand to give me a good idea of where I'd want it. Here's a great example of making do with the parts you have in your garage. Now moving on to the spindle bracket. These are, I would say, a very important piece to make sure that the angle's correct and that you get a really beefy weld on that. One of the very first go-karts I made from scratch, the first time I rode it right out of my garage, it broke right there at that spindle bracket weld, and that's when I learned about what a full penetration weld was. So not that I'm an expert welder by all means, but I throw down as much weld as I can just to make sure that that bracket does not pop off, since it sees quite a bit of the force that's put on the go-kart. These were just simple washers that I had lying around, and also just some bar stock that I had. Really small piece. What you're trying to do is just get a pivot point, something to give you a couple inches of moment to be able to steer well enough. And these bushings, they were just some 5/8 bar stock bushings. They fit right over that bar. and once it was all aligned and I had it right where I wanted to, then I welded the steering wheel in place. Kind of simple as that. Only downside to this system is if you have an issue with it, you are most likely cutting off that bar and redoing it. Right here, I want to emphasize, if you don't have perfect plans in advance, you'll want to trial fit everything before pretty much you get too far down into it. That's why you'll notice that I'm testing out the steering and the pedals, that they don't hit the steering rods or shafts or anything. Really just making sure that it has the full range of motion for both the pedals and the steering. You don't want to be making a turn and then having the pedal hit. And right now that I've seen that everything does fit up just right, I'm going through and making my full welds on all of the joints. Like I mentioned earlier, you will want to double check all of your welds, especially those spindle brackets, just so that when you take it out on the road, you don't have it crumple in half on you. Next up is the drivetrain. Here's where I will talk a little about the pedals, the engine mount, bearings, kind of all the odds and ends, everything left. In the model, I used just some square tubing as the engine mount, and that does work great. The only drawback to that is it's a lot harder to drill out some slots. And if you've ever put together the engine with a chain, slotted holes makes it extremely easy to get the tension just right. So I used that bracket for the engine mount, and to get those slots in the right location, most engines have very similar hole patterns. So for example, this is a 6.5 horsepower engine. I simply went on to harborfreight.com and they actually have those dimensions listed there. So I drew it up, printed it out, and that's what I'm using as a template for the slots. And pretty simple here. You can see all I did was punch the holes and drilling through. And to make the slots, which a majority of people might have never done before, is you can use one way of you doing it is using a jigsaw. Just make sure that you have a metal saw blade to do that. And those simple little cheap wood blades, it won't last very long. You know, you clean up the burrs and, well, voila, there's the engine mount. I had salvaged some old pedals from another go-kart, and that's what I ended up using on this one. But don't go too complicated. Pedals can really be as simple as possible. I've used just a simple bar bent at a 90-degree angle as a brake and a gas. It doesn't need to be much or fancy. You just want to make sure that the brake is beefy enough to, well, take the force to stop it. And of course, as you're welding, you may or may not run out of wire. So definitely keep some extra on hand, because there is nothing worse than running out of wire mid-project and not having any to finish it. So that's why I always keep an extra spool of flux core as well, just in case I run out of my welding gas. Here is a small bracket that is used to hold the spring back for this one's on the gas pedal side, and sometimes those springs are put up towards the front of the pedal. It doesn't matter. You just want to make sure that the springs are there to get the pedals back to their resting position. You don't want to push down on the gas and have it stay open throttle, and likewise you don't want to push on your brake and have the brake continually riding. You'll go through brake pads pretty quickly if you have it always braking on you. And speaking of the brake, I used the simplest setup, which is a drum and band system. It is also probably the cheapest setup as well. what I like to use is just an all-thread rod, or it can be a bolt. I go straight through the frame, and then that way I can make sure that it's really stiff so that the brake doesn't bend. You don't want this moving around at all, and that's kind of self-explanatory. You want the brake to be good and sturdy, and also it's really simple to add a couple of nuts to get the spacing just right. Here I pulled out the stick welder just because. No reason, just felt like it. That little bar down there that you can see, it's a simple rod that's bent at a 90-degree angle. That is what you pull or push, depending on where you're looking at it, that compresses the band over the brake drum. Next up, I am replacing the bearings in the front wheels. I decided to put this in the video just to show you really how easy it is to replace those bearings. And they're super cheap to get online as well. All you do is you get a screwdriver or something to push through on the one end, and then you just pop these other ones right into place. Simple as that, and the bearings are nice and smooth. Next up is the paint. I do want to mention that I didn't show, but prior to this I did wipe down the entire frame, or pretty much all the steel, with some acetone. Really, you can use mineral spirits, any type of solvent that gets off the oily grime and substance. Usually when you pick up steel from a steel mill or from a shop, it will have kind of a protective oil or grease on it. Pretty much makes it so it doesn't rust before you need it. And then the primers and paints, that's up to you. I don't know if the Harbor Freight by you has the same products, but they actually have a filler primer that works really well. It does hide some of the blemishes and scratches that you'll be getting from the fabrication side of things. And as far as final paint, Harbor Freight really doesn't cover a line of colors, so you're better off going to Walmart or a paint store to get the exact color you want. I like this fluorescent green. It looks pretty cool and pops with the black. A Kart this size, I used roughly 3, maybe 4 cans, and I only showed 1 coat. I did do 2 coats, and then about 2 coats of a gloss clear coat. Finally to the fun part, assembly. You really don't need that many special tools other than your typical sockets and open-end wrenches, maybe a couple Allen wrenches depending on the collars or types of fasteners you used. Everything's laid out and it does go pretty quickly. Right now I'm just going through and finger tightening these fasteners. You'll take note that when you are assembling this, you'll want to use either nuts with Loctite or nylon nuts. That way you'll make sure that nothing comes loose when you're riding down, because these go-karts, they do shake and rattle a bit, and you'd be surprised about how many bolts will come loose if they're not tight or they don't have any locking type system. It's time to move into the back axle assembly. I designed the Kart with some pillow block bearings, and that's mostly because these bearings aren't too expensive. They're cheap and they're really easy to assemble, and it keeps everything nice and in line, and you're not having to really weld the bearing brackets on, which if misaligned can cause a lot of headache. After those bearings are all bolted up nice and tight, I move on to the brake. Something that's really nice about a live axle is that you have room to get in there and move stuff around, whereas when it's a one-wheel drive, you're kind of crammed between the engine, the sprocket, and the brake band. But this is kind of like my dad's old Ford truck. You got all kinds of room to work in the engine bay. The dually tires is, well, it was strictly for show. There's really no point in having both of them, other than it was just something that I had, and decided to, what the heck, put them all on. Why not, right? Next, I hooked up the throttle cable, and I actually have another video that goes into a little more detail of how to do that, which I am going to link up above. Yep, right there. That's another video you can check out if you have questions about the throttle cable. It's really simple, just a couple screws and some springs. Moving on to the seat, you can't get more basic than that. It's 4 bolts holding on the seat. The chain, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated, and my suggestion would be is to get a chain breaker. It just makes life a lot easier. You'll also notice that I don't tighten the bolts until after the chain is in place, and this just makes setting the tension for the chain a lot easier. And finally, just for looks, I added some grip tape, but these little modifications, they're all up to you. All said and done, I really like how this cart turned out, and I'm sure one of the biggest questions I'm going to be asked is, how much did I spend on it? Short answer is, I have no clue. And that's mostly because I had a majority of these parts just lying around. If you wanted to go through and piece it all out, go-karts are pretty expensive if you buy it by the piece. If you want to go cheap, my suggestion would be to check your classified ads for a frame that just needs some little modifications or maybe an engine thrown on it. Congratulations for making it this far. If you liked the video, leave a comment and a like. See you next time.